Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today is my second video in honor of Juneteenth, the holiday commemorating the emancipation of enslaved Africans from slavery in the US. I have decided to do two videos in honor of this holiday about lesser known struggles that have been faced in the Americas by enslaved Africans outside of the US. Because while Juneteenth itself is specifically for the emancipation of enslaved Africans in the US, the holiday is an important time to remember and discuss all Black history in the Americas. And it is used as such by many in the Black community and outside. So I feel it's important to bring up the two of the most successful attempts at emancipation by enslaved Africans via revolutions, with my previous video being on the 1733 slave rebellion in St. John, a Danish colony, and today's subject being the Haitian Revolution, the most successful rebellion led by enslaved Africans in the Americas, period, and arguably the most influential rebellion in the age of revolution. Yes, even more influential than the American Revolution, which I'll discuss later on in the video. So where is Haiti? Well, Haiti is one of two countries that currently makes up the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, with Haiti taking up the left and the sometimes more stable Dominican Republic in the eastern half of the island. However, in the mid 1500s and early 1600s, late 1500s and early 1600s, Hispaniola was a colony in the Spanish Empire. But by the 1680s, the rival kingdom of France would negotiate a deal with Spain, which led to Spain ceding half of Hispaniola to France, whom created the colony known as Saint-Domingue, which pretty much immediately began creating an economy based off of the use of enslaved Africans. This makes sense, as this was a time of what was called the triangular trade, where enslaved Africans purchased from rival kingdoms and other areas on the west coast of Africa, the Gold Coast, and the Ivory Coast, would be shipped over to the Americas, where they would be worked in horrid conditions, either to near death or to death itself, to harvest things like sugar, cacao, tobacco, etc., to be shipped to areas like New England, where rum and other goods would be exchanged in return. It would be exchanged between the sugar and sent back to Africa to repeat the process. And this actually made Saint-Domingue the most productive, and sometimes most prosperous, but not always, but the most productive, definitely, colony in the French Empire. And many of these enslaved Africans came from, one, the Kingdom of Congo, sometimes as prisoners of war, but also as things like criminals and soldiers. And eventually, when the Kingdom of Congo was defeated by rival kingdoms, members of the Kingdom of Congo themselves. And then other Africans used as slaves in the colony of Saint-Domingue were the Yoruba from the Gold Coast here in Africa, which makes up things like modern Benin and Ghana and such. And these enslaved Africans would face some of the most horrid conditions that you can imagine. Like I said, they would be worked to the bone. I think the estimates have been like 18 hours or more, until either almost death or just death itself. But also they would face horrid conditions like malnutrition, dehydration, and diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. These individuals here are on the beds are from those diseases. Now, it should be noted that the wealthy landowners who made up the minority of the population, weren't immune from these diseases. They would suffer these diseases as well, but by far, the enslaved Africans would would suffer disproportionately from these diseases and conditions. And this makes sense, as in Saint Domingue, as in many other colonies, there was a rigid caste system in place where no matter how you look at it, people of mixed race or just African in general were always subservient to white citizens in one way or another. So at the top, you had the rich white plantation owners, and yeah, there were the rich landowners of mixed race, but they were still subservient to whites. Yeah, you had the indentured white servants from France who were below the free mixed race lower class, but the free mixed race lower class was still subservient to the poor white French immigrants. And then all the way at the bottom, you had mixed race slaves and African slaves, or black slaves, but at this point in time, they would have probably been specifically African, as well as escaped slave communities or maroon communities, where they would run away and hide in the wilderness and create their own communities where they would be free, but they had not been, quote unquote, granted their freedom, quote unquote, legally, because really in real life it shouldn't matter. You shouldn't be enslaved in general. But anyways, in the eyes of the colonial government, they were not legally free, but they would still escape to their freedom to create these communities. And this created a massive environment and culture where all these classes essentially hated each other a lot, creating a very contentious environment with the black slaves and the mulatto slaves facing horrible treatment. Now, there was some attempts to stop this, as Louis XIV, the Sun King, the French king who built the Palace of Versailles, didn't always agree with the treatment, at least to a point, of the enslaved Africans. So he eventually created the Code Noir, or the Black Codes, ordering the mistreatment of enslaved Africans to stop. Of course, many of the wealthy landowners just simply ignored this. So, take it for what you will. And also, the so-called Sun King Louis XIV was a pretty terrible person on itself, and he's one of the many reasons that the French Revolution eventually happened. It was his son that it happened under, but still. So, of course, all this contention and class warfare to a point, as well as the mistreatment of enslaved Africans, eventually led to an individual named Francois Mackandal, who was a priest of a religion that was a mix of traditional African beliefs and native indigenous beliefs of the Americas, voodoo. He was a Vodun priest, to gather a group of like-minded individuals, and this was done because he was a very charismatic individual, and was just described as being very inspiring. So he gathered all these like-minded individuals in the late 1740s, early 1750s, and began rampaging through Saint Domingue in attempts to start a revolution similar to how the Haitian Revolution would eventually be. He was, however, eventually captured and burned at the stake. But because of his charisma and how inspiring he was, many of these rebel groups that he created and led continued to fight well after his death. And in fact, many of them would eventually become part of the Haitian Revolution itself. And this further began to come to a head in the 1740s and late 1750s onward, because of what was called the Enlightenment era, where slavery began to become increasingly viewed as immoral, as it should be, but still increasingly viewed as immoral, with many individuals such as Thomas Raynal over here often openly attacking slavery and stating that it should be abolished. Many of these individuals included free black landowners such as Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Baptiste Belley. And Jean-Baptiste Belley, Toussaint Louverture, and others constantly advocated for the abolishment of slavery in Saint-Domingue. And eventually it looked like maybe this might happen because in 1791, the French Revolution began and ended with the storming of the Bastille and the slaughtering of most of the French nobility and the establishment of a Republican government, at least temporarily. And this Republican government signed into law what was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, or the Declaration of the Rights of Humans, however you want to look at it. A declaration that had actually been proposed by Raynal himself earlier on, therefore saying that slavery was abolished under the new republic. Therefore, like I said, giving hope to individuals like Jean-Baptiste Belley and Toussaint Louverture that this might actually happen. But unsurprisingly, yet again, many of the wealthy landowners, much like under the rule of Louis XIV, just simply ignored this law and continued their horrid treatment of enslaved Africans and also free Africans as well, eventually leading to an outright revolution where basically every enslaved African on the island, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much, rose up and began this revolution. And of course, many of the leaders included Jean-Baptiste Belley and Toussaint Louverture, but others included individuals such as Duty Bookman and a very interesting individual over here on the right, Romain la Prophetess. Romain was a wealthy free black landowner who identified themselves as a woman and a prophetess. And so at the beginning of the revolution, they dressed themselves completely as a woman for the rest of their lives, and making them one of the earliest examples of a transgender or gender fluid person leading a revolution. So with this revolution beginning, the rebels fought in many major battles labeled here in red and had a lot of success. Many of the wealthy white landowners, though not all, began to flee back to France, as well as many, again, though not all, of the wealthy white and wealthy mixed race landowners fleeing to areas like Jamaica, Cuba, and as well as Spanish Florida, Louisiana, all the way up to Georgia and New York, and etc. And we'll expand upon this a little bit later, but this had, of course, had a great effect on the U.S. In the coming years. And despite their successes, early successes in the revolution, many superpowers of the time took notice. One, because they were afraid that this might inspire other revolutions in their nation and their empires, but also because France asked for help. And so, after being asked for help, as well as their fear of inspired revolutions, the other two major players other than France at the time, France and the Qing Empire in China, which is another video in itself at the time, took it upon themselves to try and invade Saint-Domingue to put down the rebellion themselves. First, starting with Spain over here on the right. However, Spain didn't see much successes. They ran into the same horde conditions that the enslaved Africans and other citizens of Saint-Domingue had seen: malaria, yellow fever, dehydration, etc., as well as concerted attempts by the rebel groups through guerrilla warfare. So because of all of these, because of the horde conditions and the heavy fighting, eventually Spain was forced to withdraw. Britain, on the other hand, under William Pitt, did gather a large force of British soldiers and began what is known as the British Great Push. Now, to be clear, there's another event known as the British Great Push that's involved with one of the world wars. So this British Great Push, I'm calling the British Great Push into Saint-Domingue, just to give differentiation. So the Great Push into Saint-Domingue saw a lot of the same issues that the Spanish invasion did. Heavy fighting from guerrilla warfare against by the rebel groups, dehydration, malaria, yellow fever, lack of supplies, etc. And so they too were eventually forced to withdraw, making it look like for a little while that the revolution had succeeded. However, there was still internal strife going on as well in the rebel command, as many individuals wanted to be the primary leader themselves. And this eventually led to two individuals specifically having a civil war called the War of the Knives. And these individuals were André Rigaud over here on the left and Toussaint Louverture, the wealthy black landowner who had been a proponent of the Enlightenment. Eventually, Toussaint Louverture won out and became the supreme commander of this new nation that they were trying to build. However, despite the success and despite Toussaint Louverture consolidating his power, things were about to get a whole lot worse before they got better. And that was because the big bad in Europe at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, had finally consolidated his power in France. For a while, he had been sort of the chancellor, the supreme chancellor, sort of the supreme commander of the military in the French Republic. But eventually he seized power for himself, declaring himself emperor of the new French Empire. And he needed money. See, he had been fighting in a war all this time across the continent and was about to fight a lot more wars, and he needed money and supplies. So he felt it was time to invade Saint-Domingue and put down this rebellion and take back the most productive colony, like I said earlier in the video, of the French Empire, Saint-Domingue. And so he brought a large army and invaded Saint-Domingue in the early 1800s, I believe 1801. And he was able to defeat the rebel leaders in various confrontations. The Battle of Ravine-Colvert, as well as in a siege at Crête-à-Perrieux. However, these battles didn't really end the rebellion. In fact, they played a similar role to, say, the Alamo or Pearl Harbor in U.S. history, in Haitian history. They became symbols. They became things to look back upon, to inspire, to say that. Now, I don't know, none of my research has suggested they ever said, remember Crête-à-Perrieux or anything like that, but still, they became calling cards, battle cries, essentially, figuratively, to continue the fight. That being said, eventually, weary of the fighting, several of the rebel leaders temporarily switched sides in hopes that the fighting would finally end. And they, together with Napoleon, captured Toussaint Louverture and imprisoned him in Fort de Joux, where he did eventually die. It's not known exactly what caused his death. However, there are a few guesses that you would expect somebody would suffer from in a prison from the 1800s, or especially the early 1800s. Dehydration, malnutrition, possibly disease, anything. But either way, he did eventually die. And this, combined with the fact that the fighting did not end, caused a lot of remorse among many of the people who had helped capture Toussaint Louverture. Foremost among them was Jean-Jacques Delanne, the individual over here on the right, who, after feeling remorse for this, as well as realizing the fighting was not going to end, took leadership of the revolution and became Toussaint Louverture's successor and helped continue the fight. Concurrently with this, Napoleon decided, rather than continuing to send in some of his best French troops, that it was time to send in auxiliaries from one of the conquered nations, that the prince had taken over during the war, and that being Poland. So thousands of Polish legionaries were sent into Saint-Domingue. And this is important because during this time, Poland had been suffering from a lot of strife, having suffered multiple partitions, is what they're called, partitions, by various foreign powers. Before the 1770s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a superpower in Europe on its own. It rivaled France, Britain, Sweden, the Kingdom of Denmark, and the Holy Roman Empire, as well as Spain. But after the 30 Years' War and the Great Northern War, it eventually began to weaken until in the 1770s, it began to have multiple partitions and began to be taken over by multiple foreign powers, such as Russia, the powerful German state of Prussia, Austria, and as well as France. In Napoleon specifically's France. And so because of this, the Polish and the free blacks and enslaved Africans in the rebellion of Saint-Domingue began to sort of see a form of mutual respect. And in fact, Jean-Jacques Delanne described the Polish as the white Negroes of Europe, which he used as a term of endearment to describe them because of the strife that they were facing from other nations. And the respect, again, was mutual by the Polish legionaries. Furthermore, eventually, Napoleon appointed the Viscount of Rochambeau, or Vicomte de Rochambeau, as the primary commander of the invasion force of Saint-Domingue. This is an individual who helped George Washington and the Continental Army win the American Revolution. And he gained how do I put this? He gained a reputation for being absolutely horrible and brutal. He would slaughter entire camps of women and children, anything you could name. He did it under the idea that he was going to win this war at any means necessary. But this sort of began to come to an end as Napoleon and his eternal picking a bone with Britain led to Britain declaring war on France. And part of this was Britain sending a fleet to blockade Saint-Domingue, as it was, again, the most prosperous and productive, well, not prosperous at this point in time, but the most productive of the French colonies. So, of course, if you want to essentially neuter and starve out a powerful empire, you go after their breadbasket. And that's exactly what they did. Furthermore, during this blockade, as they were now at war with France and not being asked to invade on behalf of France, the British Navy took it upon themselves to supply arms and ammunition and other supplies to the rebels on Saint-Domingue, actually making the rebels stronger. And eventually this allowed the rebels of Saint-Domingue to defeat the French at the Battle of Vertières. I hope I pronounced that right. Apologies if I butchered that. In 1803, and completely drive the French out of Saint-Domingue, and leading them to create the independent empire of Haiti. Haiti coming from the name that indigenous peoples such as the Taino and the Carib and other indigenous groups called the island. And they even created their own Declaration of Independence. That being said, much like with the capture and imprisonment of Toussaint Louverture, the leadership of the Haitian Revolution did not have clean hands, especially, again, Jean-Jacques Delanne, who played a particularly key part in the capture of Toussaint Louverture. And he further bloodied his hands, or further stained his hands, by, in 1804, slaughtering as many of the white French population on Saint-Domingue, on Haiti, at this point in time, that he could find. absolutely horrifying many of the European nations. So with that, it's important to ask what, other than the obvious effect on the French white landowners, what massive effect, what sort of effects did this have on the wider world at large? Well, quite a lot. One of the most immediate effects was the effects that the Haitian Revolution had on the United States. For one thing, during the Revolution, as well as after, the first three presidents of the United States, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, refused to even acknowledge the Haitian Revolution. And then after the success of the Haitian Revolution, Thomas Jefferson refused to acknowledge their sovereignty. He saw them as an illegitimate country. And while there were a few reasons for this, the absolutely primary reason for this, the biggest reason, period, was he did not want this successful rebellion by enslaved Africans to inspire the enslaved Africans in the U.S. to rebel themselves. Yep, that's right. The good old fear of servile insurrection, which, to be fair, did actually happen in Saint Domingue, but it had a variety of factors, some of which the U.S. did have, such as the horrible treatment that enslaved Africans were facing and Enlightenment ideas. But Saint Domingue also had several wealthy free black landowners who were advocating for it, as well as the rigid caste system that was causing class strife, the French Revolution, as well as even after the success of the French Revolution, the wealthy landowners of Saint Domingue refusing to acknowledge the revolution and continuing their horrible treatments. So there is that. However, it should also, it's irrelevant, because even if these slave rebellions happened in the U.S., which some of them did, and we'll cover that in a minute, it shouldn't matter. Being enslaving somebody is wrong. So why we're even entertaining the idea that they shouldn't be freed is ridiculous. But that's not the only effect that the Haitian Revolution had on the U.S. It also had an effect on the expansion of the U.S. into the North American continent. And that's because with the loss of Saint Domingue, as well as the debts that he was accruing fighting basically every country in Europe, Napoleon needed more money to continue to fight his wars. And so when Jefferson and his diplomatic delegation approached Napoleon, originally just wanting New Orleans, Napoleon was like, how about this? You can have all of it for several million francs in some, or several million American dollars in some as well. They translate a little bit, but there's a little bit of a difference in value, resulting in the Louisiana Purchase. That's right, the Louisiana Purchase is a direct result of the Haitian Revolution, something that no American school ever teaches. But this Louisiana Purchase allowed for the U.S. to literally double its land in practically overnight. It also had an effect on the U.S. through its mass migrations. As I said earlier, many mixed race as well as white landowners in Haiti, in Saint Domingue, began to flee to the United States. Of course, many of them fled to France, Jamaica, and Cuba, and Spanish Florida, but a great many of these mixed race landowners and free white landowners fled to areas like New Orleans, Savannah, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, etc. And it actually made the fear of servile insurrection worse, because one, the free black landowners, the Americans knew that Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Delanne, Jean-Baptiste Belley, etc., were Romain La Prophetess, were all free black landowners themselves. So in the eyes of the United States, how do they know that they didn't also share those ideas with the rebel leaders? But also the free black landowners and the free white landowners brought many of their enslaved Africans with them. So again, oh no, these are enslaved Africans from that colony that just where the enslaved Africans rebelled and overthrew the wealthy white landowners. So how do we know that's not going to happen to us? Well, to answer that question, it sort of did. Now, this rebellion by enslaved Africans it's hard to prove whether or not the Haitian Revolution actually had that much of an impact on it. But it's without that proof, it's still, regardless of that, it's still pretty easy to assume, and it's not a huge leap in logic to assume that it did have a direct response on it, especially with what we're about to talk about in a little bit. And so in 1811, in Louisiana, where many of these free black and free white landowners from Saint-Domingue fled, specifically at the Woodland Plantation, 200 enslaved Africans began a revolt, fighting their way all the way up to the Joux Fortier plantation, where eventually they were stopped by the U.S. military and either hunted down and killed or recaptured. And it should be noted that this is the largest rebellion led by enslaved Africans in the history of the United States itself. And this is important because, as you see over here, with what was called Grand Colombia, the Haitian Republic, the independent empire of Haiti, eventually would become the Haitian Republic, had a direct influence on other revolutions, specifically the rebellion in South America led by individuals such as Simon Bolivar, of which Bolivia is named after, and others, that eventually led to the formation of Gran Colombia, which was a powerful nation for a time, established, consisting of areas like parts of northern Bolivia, Ecuador, Guyana, Panama, etc. And this revolution had direct support from the independent empire of Haiti. They said, we support you, and they provided supplies and help to Simon Bolivar and his constituents. Furthermore, during the, I want to say about 60 years between the Haitian Revolution, many enslaved Africans began to migrate to Haiti. Starting in 1824, where several hundred African Americans migrated there, but it continued well into the 1860s with over 800 from Connecticut and Canada immigrating there, and then eventually in 1863, Abraham Lincoln moved 553 more there, and this is part of his idea connected to shipping, once emancipating them from slavery, shipping former enslaved Africans, free Africans, to places like Liberia and, of course, Haiti, which sounds like a horrible thing, and yes, it is, unfortunately. It's unfortunately fortunate that he had that idea, but it was an idea back then that was used by a lot of abolitionists, including Abraham Lincoln. So even though Abraham Lincoln was very much anti-slavery, he didn't want free blacks living in his country with him either. So either way, but this meant that the independent empire of Haiti, or the Republic of Haiti, depending on the time, was a key place where many enslaved Africans fled for freedom, especially after Florida, which was originally one of these safe havens, became a U.S. state. And then another revolution that the independent empire of Haiti and the Republic of Haiti inspired was the Greek War of Independence, where again, they provided support and aid to the Greek rebels to help fight the Greek War of Independence, which went on from 1821 to 1822. Now, to be fair, the Greek War of Independence was also inspired by the French Revolution, but it was very much inspired just as much by the Haitian Revolution and the independent empire of Haiti as it was inspired by the French Revolution. So there you go. This in essence shows that the Haitian Revolution was very much more impactful than the American Revolution. I mean, yes, the American Revolution impacted the French Revolution and severely impacted the indigenous peoples and the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the enslaved Africans in the United States, and that certainly should not be forgotten. And I have many videos dedicated to that. But that's really about it. Whereas the Haitian Revolution impacted the indigenous peoples on the island, it made everyone on the island free except for the wealthy French landowners under Jean-Jacques Delan's rule. It inspired thousands of enslaved Africans to flee to Haiti for freedom. It affected the United States itself as well as France, and it inspired several revolutions. Or, you know, compare that to America's one revolution that it inspired. So there's that. And I would argue that the Haitian Revolution should be the focal point of the Age of Revolution rather than the American Revolution for this fact. However, all of this being said, this time of prosperity for the independent Empire of Haiti and the Republic of Haiti would eventually slowly come to an end. As in 1825, many American politicians, including Thomas Jefferson, but not limited to Thomas Jefferson, worked together with Britain and France and Spain to impose 30 million francs worth of annuities and debt onto the, at this point in time, it was the Haitian Republic, in order to, quote unquote, make Haiti pay for the losses of property, quote unquote, that France lost during this revolution. And of course, back then, when $1,000 could be equal to 10,000 or more, this was a Herculean sum to impose on a country, especially a country as small as the Republic of Haiti. So eventually, over the course of the next 100 or so years, this debt would slowly begin to drive Haiti into bankruptcy and into poverty. Eventually, you know, to the point they even had to, in the 1920s, ask for loans and such from the U.S. in order to pay it off. And eventually they did pay it off in the 1940s, but to this day they are, because of this, a poor nation. So it's important to remember that the condition that Haiti is in right now is directly, the United States is directly responsible for that. The U.S. is directly responsible for the condition of Haiti as it is now, which is something that we should not forget and the U.S. should acknowledge. So there is that. But again, the Haitian Revolution did, for a time, inspire many other events throughout the world. So that ends our video. I know it ends it on sort of a it ended on sort of a bad ending, a sad ending, but you know, we can use this knowledge to, one, acknowledge that what the US and other European countries did wrong, but we can also use this knowledge to teach about the importance of the Haitian Revolution, as well as use it to eventually bring Haiti and other nations back from the brink of the poverty that essentially, no, not essentially, that the US definitely put them in. And that's why this video is important for Juneteenth, as much as, if not a little more than my previous video, the 1733 rebellion on St. John. And I'm sorry that I can't end it on a happier ending, but this is the history of Haiti, and we have to acknowledge it before we can move forward. So with that, again, remember Juneteenth, use Juneteenth to take the time to study accurate history of Africans and African Americans and their relationships with being enslaved as well as being free. Again, these two previous videos were about attempting to emancipate themselves. And if you want to see me cover any other subjects, be it more subjects in Black history or any other subjects in world history, feel free to leave a comment. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you have a good day.